I want to talk about two defining qualities of being a human being, maybe the two defining qualities, things that distinguish us in some ways from all other creatures. And they are what I'm going to call authority and vulnerability. So, by authority, let's think very broadly as capacity for meaningful action. This means that we're going to use authority for any time when you can act in the world and it matters, it makes a difference, it has meaning to you and to others. So I'm using it broader than having a title or a position, though sometimes a title and position gives you the capacity to meaningfully act. But anytime you can meaningfully act and it's going to make a difference, we'll say that you have authority. I actually think this is something that human beings have more than any of the creatures we share this world with. Other creatures do act in the world, but we act with a level of capacity to make a difference in the world and with a kind of quest for meaning, an ability to give what we do meaning that just exceeds any other creature. It's a defining feature of being human that we're on this quest, appropriate quest for authority. Then there's vulnerability. And by this, I also want to use this word pretty broadly. Sometimes we use it just to mean sort of emotional openness, or sometimes we mean in a social service context, kind of being in a very needy situation. But in fact, I want to use vulnerability very broadly for any time that you are exposed to meaningful risk. That is, something that really matters to you can be lost. Risk is the possibility of loss. And in this also, I think human beings have more of this than any other creature. We live with more consciousness of risk than probably any other animal, any other entity we share our world with, because we live, for one thing, very dependent lives. We're dependent at the beginning of our lives more for longer than any other creatures, 5 or 6 years before a small human being could ever hope to provide for themselves. At the end of our lives, we're dependent in old age for longer than almost any other creature. And our whole lives, we're intertwined with other people and seek ultimately love. And while love is a beautiful thing, it's also a very vulnerable thing. And it's the defining quality of being human that we seek these connections with each other that also mean that our whole lives are lived with a consciousness of meaningful risk. Authority and vulnerability. I think in some ways this is a beautiful, simple summary of what it is to be human. And I also think it's when these two things happen together that we experience what I would want to call flourishing. Flourishing, meaning, I guess, fullness of life, like the life that really is life, life at its best, almost always I have found involves these two ingredients. When you ask people, what are the peak moments of your life? Like, was it a soccer game where you scored the winning goal? Is it being a parent? There's all kinds of different answers. Sometimes it's starting a business. And whenever you ask people and they give you the peak moments of their lives, it turns out that it always has a component of authority. That is, they had the capacity to act and have it matter, and a component of vulnerability. Something really was at stake. Something could be lost, whether it was or not. And they were very conscious of it. And yet they were also conscious, I'm actually living the life I was made for. I want to put this on a chart, a 2x2 chart. I love 2x2 charts. There's many 2x2 charts in the world that are valuable. I think this may be the most important one of all. So we're going to put authority on the y-axis and vulnerability on the x. And so on this chart, flourishing will be up and to the right. When you're high in both, when you're up and to the right in this chart, you're going to be living the life you're made for. High authority, high vulnerability. But the great thing about 2x2s is they give us the alternatives, and there's 3 corners, and let's think about them each in turn. Let's think first about the opposite corner to flourishing. That would be the lower left, which will be low authority and low vulnerability. So this is a situation where you don't have to act, maybe can't act, don't need to act, and also you don't experience risk. You don't experience any possibility of loss. And the word that I would suggest captures this, at least initially, is safety. Safety being an environment where you really are protected from risk and you actually are kind of protected from having to act. Somehow you're able to just be and not worry. And I actually think this is where every healthy, happy human life begins and where every human life is meant to begin. Our parents, to the extent that they could, almost certainly sought to create this for us when we were very small. Almost every parent wishes this for their very small child. an environment where they don't have much capacity to act, which is why we swaddle them in swaddling clothes. It's why we put the side up on the crib so they can't just climb out, at least early on. We're creating an environment with limited authority, but we also cover up all the outlets and in other ways kind of try to remove the risk from the life of a small child. And actually, this is where children thrive. Babies, when they're held very tightly by their parents, they can't move their arms and their limbs very much, but they feel very little sense of risk. And they just enter this beautiful state called quiet alert, where they just behold the world and other people. And this is a beautiful, beautiful beginning. It's not where we're meant to stay, and babies do not stay swaddled, and they don't stay inside the crib. And actually, parents don't want them to. All of our parents, to the extent that they cared for us and did their best with us, wanted us gradually to move up and to the right on this graph. And human development, in some ways, is the move in sort of step by step in greater amounts of authority and in greater amounts of meaningful risk. So the child eventually goes off to school, and one day goes to middle school, which is more vulnerability for most people. Eventually gets a driver's license, at least my kids did, and that's the literal authority to drive a car. However, the insurance company also seems to feel it involves a lot of exposure to risk. So as a parent, as I watch this unfold in my children's life, I actually celebrate this because this is actually what I'm there for, to help them grow in both meaningful action and meaningful risk. In fact, in some ways, I would say this is the pathway that creative power is designed to unlock. If you have power in other people's lives, you're meant to use it for their good to help them increase in authority and also increase in vulnerability, because that's actually the path for all of us to flourish. So this is a beautiful picture. I actually think it's the way the human story was meant to play out, because of course the human story, as narrated in the Bible, actually starts in an environment of safety, the garden, which God has prepared and protected to limit in certain ways the first human beings' authority and to limit their exposure to risk. But God has already told them, your mission is to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. They're going to leave the garden. They're going to move out. And I think we were meant to move up and to the right, greater and greater authority in the world, but also greater vulnerability in the world. This is not all there is to the human story, though, as it actually has turned out. And so let's go to the lower right corner. So this would be vulnerability without authority. So this is a situation where you are very exposed to risk, but you have no capacity to meaningfully act. And I would say maybe the best word for this corner is suffering. This is the only corner, by the way, on this 2x2, where I can go into any room, anywhere in the world of human beings, and know that everyone in the room has experienced it. Many of us have experienced flourishing. Maybe most of us who would watch a video like this can name times in our lives when we had that joyful life that is really life kind of feeling. Probably because at some stage in our lives, we did have a kind of safety and our parents were able to provide that. But many parents are not able to provide that for their kids. And many people never get to taste real authority and vulnerability together in a healthy way. But every one of us, including the most privileged, the most protected, at least if you made it through middle school, you have experienced this lower right corner. You've experienced suffering. And when we experience this, we do start to think about, or maybe dream about, the upper left, the opposite corner, which would be authority without vulnerability, which sounds appealing, right? Wouldn't it be great to be able to act without the possibility of loss, without risk? And I think the best name for this corner is control. Control being a situation or a system in which you can act meaningfully, make a difference, without any doubt about how it's going to go. And control is basically a property of mechanical systems. It's a property of machines. The things we build that we call machines are systems that have very high degrees of reliable action, and all the risk has been engineered away, such that when you want the machine to do the thing, it usually does the thing. The problem is, the universe is not a machine. It's not built that way. The universe, I think, was built by God with a kind of risk. And human beings are not machines. And human systems, human societies, human families, human organizations are not machines. There's an inherent vulnerability to being human, I think designed in and given by God, because even in the garden, the human beings were naked, though without shame. And naked is a word for vulnerability, though without shame. We were meant to have these two things together. And this means that in the most consequential environments in our lives, you actually can't have control. It's a mirage, but a powerful mirage. And the quest for this mirage is in some ways at the heart of the distortion of the human story that all of us live with today. And the Bible's name for this distortion, I think, first of all, is idolatry. An idol being, in the biblical mind, something that human beings orient their lives around, come to worship and devote themselves to, in the belief, almost, I think, universally, that it will give us authority without vulnerability. What idols promise is authority without vulnerability. And this is true of the very first human encounter with an alternative to the good pathway of God, which is when the woman and the man encountered the serpent in the garden. The serpent tempts them to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and makes the promise, if you eat the fruit, you shall be like God. What is that promise? That is maximal authority. All the capacity for meaningful action you can imagine, the kind of authority that your maker has, that the creator has, you'll be like that. And then the woman protests or pushes back and says, well, God's told us if we eat the fruit, we'll die because we're dependent on him for life. And to be dependent is to be vulnerable. And the serpent says, you shall not surely die. In other words, you are not as vulnerable as you think you are. You can have all this authority without the risk that God has told you you'll have. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And they eat. They take the offer. They start the quest for the upper left. And the thing about idols, all idols, I would say, is that they work in a way. They work at first. The problem is they don't keep working. The things that we orient our lives around thinking, if I pursue this thing, it will give me control. Pretty much universally, the initial result is a sensation of authority without vulnerability. But the long-term result is vulnerability without authority. The woman and the man do kind of have their eyes open to good and evil. They become aware of all kinds of features of their environment they weren't before, such as their own nakedness. But this does not come with an overwhelming sense of power and possibility. It quickly turns into a sense of shame and diminishment and fear and hiding. And all idols, which promise to give you the upper left, actually give you the lower right. The thing that starts out giving you authority without vulnerability will eventually give you vulnerability without authority, will in fact compound the suffering that you may be experiencing. And this thing that you thought would put you in the upper left actually leads to the absolute opposite corner. This is one way biblically of describing the fallen human story, but there is another equally biblical way, and it's to add the term injustice to the upper left. Because I think what injustice is, and the biblical writers go back and forth between these two topics almost without distinguishing them, is injustice is just a social system built around an idol that is designed to give some people the experience or the sensation or the simulation of authority without vulnerability at the expense of other people in the system experiencing only vulnerability without authority. That's an unjust system where some people seem to get to live up into the left, but then you look at the system and other people are living with incredible amounts of vulnerability and no authority. This is the biblical diagnosis of what has gone wrong. We have given ourselves to idols. We've built systems of injustice to try to keep the idol game going. And it characterizes every human system in one way or another. I live on the east coast of the United States, the east coast of what became called the Americas. The Americas were settled by Europeans who found that the land of this continent on its eastern seaboard was incredibly fertile for what came to be known as cash crops. The kinds of crops that when you grow them, they don't actually feed your family or your community. You can't sustain a whole society on them, but you can sell them. If you can establish a triangle of trade, you can actually exchange them for money and become incredibly wealthy. And many people did by growing along the eastern seaboard from north to south, tobacco, cotton, and sugarcane. The early crops of the Americas, which made many early settlers fantastically wealthy and made the empires that sent them here fantastically wealthy, were very vulnerable to produce. They required incredible amounts of labor in very difficult conditions. And this group of settlers, this whole system was built that said, what if we could find a vulnerable group of human beings, in this case on the west coast of Africa, and force them into bearing the vulnerability of producing all this wealth, but without giving them authority? Because what is to be enslaved if not to have all your authority, your capacity for meaningful action taken away? And what always comes with enslavement is kind of giving the slave the brunt of the vulnerability of the system that they're in. And what is enslavement if not taking away all authority, giving you no capacity to act, and making people bear the brunt of all the vulnerability of the system that they are in? This is the perennial, recurring human story. And the thing about this system is, why would you ever put up with it? Why would you ever allow someone to make you bear vulnerability without authority? And the answer is, these systems are always and everywhere sustained in one way or another by violence, often by literal physical violence, always by violation of human dignity. The only way you build this system is to create a system of violence that forces some people to bear vulnerability without authority. This is a troubling reality, and it's ubiquitous in our world even today. And if you have any kind of conscience, if you're at all tender of heart, you may well not want to face it, not admit that it's happening. And in certain parts of the world, if you have enough money, you can actually escape. You can actually find a place, find a corner that is quite safe, retreat to that corner, and not see and not be troubled by the systems of violence that to this day operate in our world. And when these systems are played out through time, especially over generations, and whole communities come to realize that they're part of a system that is always going to take away their authority and always going to increase beyond reason their vulnerability, I think that's when we actually get what we often recognize and name as poverty. That is not just poverty meaning a lack of money, because I don't think poverty just means a lack of money. I think poverty really names, and when we see it, what we really are seeing is a whole community that has discovered that they're part of a system that will never give them the capacity for meaningful action. They've just become resigned that the only option for them is an excess of vulnerability. And when that is built in over time and sustained by violence and violation, we have really a picture of what happens all over our world, even today. This is a very troubling reality, but it is the reality of so much of our world. And if you are at all tenderhearted, you would rather not deal with this reality, would rather not see this reality. And in certain parts of the world, there are ways to not see it and not have to deal with it. If you have enough money, you can probably buy a location, buy a corner where you will be safe from these systems of violence, where they won't directly confront you. They'll be out of sight, out of mind, and you'll have gone back to that lower left corner. Not much to do, but not much sense of risk. But this time not as an infant, not as a protected child, but this time in a move that I really would call withdrawal, where we just back away from the brutality and the difficulty and the tragedy of our world. I should say, there are other ways to maintain these systems. There's very evil ways, but there's also benevolent ways, because I think often what we call charity, where people who have benefited from systems of idolatry and justice to the point that they have certain amounts of privilege and power and wealth, see the result in the form of poverty somewhere else in the world and think, we've got to help. We have so much, they have so little. But when the form the help takes is just giving them some money or giving them some stuff, some material stuff, but does not take the form of asking, how do we restore dignity and agency and authority to this community of human beings? I think what you get then is what you would call charity at its worst. And it actually just perpetuates the same system, this same system in our world of idolatry, injustice, poverty, and withdrawal. In many ways, this now is our world. The world that was meant to be a world full of flourishing is now a world where flourishing can't be found. Maybe has never been fully tasted. Maybe we've only seen it one time, a human being who lived truly, totally up and to the right. And the rest of us live caught in this false system. What's the way out? We will need some exercises of what you might call redemptive power. So if creative power is the kind that just ushers people from safety into flourishing, redemptive power is the kind of power that actually steps into this broken system, these broken corners, and gives people a way out. And the really amazing thing is that these three arrows that would call people from the upper left, call people from the lower left, call people from the lower right, up into flourishing all together, these three arrows actually correspond in a kind of crazy way to the three offices of leadership in the biblical people of Israel, which were prophet, priest, and king. And the prophet, the priest, and the king each exercise a function in a society that corresponds to one of these arrows. So the prophet's job is to go to those who are benefiting from idolatry and injustice, benefiting for the time, benefiting in a shallow and damaging way, and call them into proper vulnerability. The priest's job is to go to those who are suffering in some way in the world and say, there is a way for you to stand up and take authority as a human being. The most vulnerable reality of being human is that we can't just walk into the presence of God in our current condition. But the priest makes a way for you to have the authority to come before God with your thanksgiving, with your petition, and gives you the authority you were meant to have as an image bearer of God. And then the king, in some ways, this kind of royal figure, is meant to live this full life before the people, kind of out in front, out in public, such that you don't want to live in withdrawal anymore. You want to live a full, flourishing human life. These are three fundamental redemptive pathways. And if you're any kind of leader, if you have any kind of responsibility for other people, you need to have these sort of in your repertoire. You need to be able to speak prophetically when idolatry and injustice seem to be winning. You need to be able to accompany in a priestly way people who have been on the receiving end of injustice. And we need to be able to live kind of public lives of flourishing so that other people realize there's something better than affluence and withdrawal. I think, however, there's one more step that's needed to truly disarm the power of idolatry and injustice in the world. And the best word that we've been able to find for it is sacrifice. In the sense that if someone were to be living this fully human life, a truly flourishing life, but for some reason willingly emptied himself of all the authority that's involved in such a life, while retaining all the vulnerability that's part of being human. If someone were to move from the upper right to the lower right, from flourishing to suffering, what would happen if someone made that choice? This is, in fact, the central story of our own faith, because it's the story of our Lord, who, though he was in very form God, did not count equality with God as something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, a slave, even to death on a cross, went all the way to the bottom right corner of the human story. And therefore, God has highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name. And one of the things I love about this particular image from Birmingham, Alabama, this stained glass image, is that it shows both our Lord, who went all the way to the depths of the lower right of the cross, but now is raised and holds the whole universe together in his authority, not just the flourishing he experienced as a human being before his death, but the flourishing he now experiences raised from the dead as the one in whom all things hold together. This story has disarmed the power of the idols and the injustice, because if Jesus could go all the way to that corner none of us would willingly go to, and was raised back from it, has returned from it to fullness of life, then the idols were lying all along. The idols were never going to give us what we needed. You don't need that left side of the graph. You don't need control. You don't ultimately need safety, because real life is lived with Jesus in this amazing cycle of sacrifice and rescue, sacrifice and resurrection. It's the life that is really life. It's the life of Jesus. And I think for us, it's the redemptive life, the way to truly live for the rescue of the world.